It's often said that we are in an unprecedented situation. Never before have we had a combination of a severe public health crisis and a severe economic crisis. And this is true. But workers in New York and in the country have gone through many crises before. And those experiences suggest ways that society changes as a result of calamities and how workers can build power during such exceptional moments. Since the late 1700s, New York City has gone through epidemics of yellow fever, cholera, polio, influenza. During the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic, 30,000 New Yorkers died, and the population was only 5.6 million then. So that's actually a death rate twice what we've experienced so far from COVID-19. We've had a series of severe economic depressions in this country, some as devastating as what we're going through right now. We've fought many wars, and it's workers who often make the greatest sacrifices. During World War II, over 5,000 members of TWU Local 100 served in the armed forces. 76 of them died, and there have been natural disasters and terrorist attacks too. As terrible as these crises were, they did not cause worker activity or class conflict. To the contrary, some of the greatest worker mobilizations in US history took place during them. In time of crisis, workers' voices have become more prominent. Unions grew, and economic and social inequalities were reduced. The 1918-1919 flu pandemic has gotten attention lately, but it's almost never noted that the greatest strike wave in American history overlapped with it. During 1919, 4 million workers went on strike. That's 1 out of every 5 non-agricultural workers in the country. And this amazing strike wave began at the very height of the epidemic, and it continued through 1920 when there was a rebound of the flu. In January 1919, during the third of what was 4 waves of influenza to hit New York, 35,000 dressmakers, 90% women, walked off their jobs to demand a shorter work week and higher wages to deal with the increased cost of living. In Seattle, the flu killed 1,400 people. The city epidemic was in its final phase when on February 6, 1919, 65,000 workers began a general strike in support of striking shipyard workers, which totally shut down the city. The epidemic was not the cause of these strikes, but it did not stop workers from hitting the streets. 2 decades later, during the mass unemployment of the Great Depression and then during the many challenges of World War II, organized labor made its greatest gains ever. Union membership soared from 3 million to 15 million. The organizational breakthrough and the New Deal laws that labor helped win led to 30 years of post-war improvements in living standards and security for working people. Racial discrimination, by no means eliminated, significantly diminished during and after the war. So why were workers able to make such progress during these periods? Part of the reason is that social crises make obvious the central role workers play in society, their indispensability. During the 2 world wars, industrial workers were hailed as soldiers on the home front, as vital as victory to soldiers and sailors in combat. After 9/11 came a new recognition of first responders and the other workers who kept the finance industry and the city going. Most of the people killed in 9/11 were not high-level executives. They were police and fire and emergency medical workers, accountants, clerks, secretaries, restaurant workers, janitors, security guards, construction workers, flight attendants. The AFL-CIO lost 633 members on that day. A New York Times reporter wrote, "A city of unsoiled and unroughened hands has learned to love a class of laborers it once tried hard not to notice." Today, we're seeing the same thing with the recognition of what had come to be called essential workers, the healthcare workers, transit workers, truck drivers, delivery workers, grocery workers, warehouse workers, meatpacking workers, home aides, and others on whom our lives depend. These workers were just as essential the day before the epidemic began, but now they're being acknowledged, clapped for, hailed in roadside signs, and given the due they always deserved. This kind of recognition can have profound effects. A shared appreciation of the importance of essential workers, of the challenges they face, and the sacrifices they have made gives them new moral standing. It can empower these workers, change the way they see themselves and how others react to them. Such recognition was one reason why workers poured into unions during the two world wars, insisting that their needs be met and also that they have a say in shaping what post-war society would be like. During World War II, African Americans launched the Double V campaign for victory against racism at home, as well as enemies abroad. The other side of the enhanced status of working people during crises has been the delegitimation of authorities and elites that were self-serving, greedy, or incompetent. By the end of World War I, there was widespread disdain for war profiteers, for bankers and industrialists who made fortunes out of the misery of war. During the Great Depression, the political and business leaders who had ridden high during the 1920s fell into disgrace when their policies contributed to economic disaster and widespread suffering. The discrediting of established leaders opened the way for new forces to take the lead, left-wing groups, unions, and reform politicians like Franklin Roosevelt. Today, we have spectacular examples of incompetence, indifference, and corruption at the highest level of the federal government. Our state and local leaders get something of a pass because by comparison, they look so much better. But their failings have been deadly too. To just take one example, how was it that not a single representative of the governor or the mayor on the MTA board protested when the agency not only failed to provide its workers with protective equipment, but actually banned bus and subway workers from wearing masks well after the pandemic was savaging the city? And what about the COVID profiteers? People like Jeff Bezos making not millions, but billions off of the misery and death we are enduring. Or the big pharmaceutical companies poised to make a killing off of COVID drugs and vaccines. What greedy sleazes they are. Not even making a gesture like giving up profits for the duration of the disease. We need to pound home the moral, logistical, and political failures of the elites. We, working people, medical professionals, ordinary folks of all kinds, we can do better, and we have to demand that we be given the chance. It was not just the elevated social and moral standing of workers during past crises that allowed them to make great gains. It was also the dependence of society on their labor and the threat of its withdrawal. Both world wars resulted in big labor shortages, which forced employers to turn to workers they had previously discriminated against, African Americans, women, and others. Like it or not, they had to make concessions on pay, conditions, union recognition. Today, the situation is somewhat different. Overall unemployment is very high, but when it comes to many key jobs, warehouse workers, transit workers, truck drivers, delivery workers, among others, there are labor shortages as a result of increased demand and the absence of sick workers. And this gives workers enhanced power. Even small, short demonstrations and walkouts have led huge anti-union companies to make significant concessions. Often, crisis time gains of labor proved short-lived. During both world wars, women got jobs they'd been previously shut out of in factories, driving trolleys and buses and elsewhere, but when the wars ended, they were forced out of these positions. The big union membership gains of World War I were almost all reversed by the mid-1920s. After 9/11, while respect continued to be paid to fallen first responders, the other worker sacrifices were soon forgotten, and Wall Street moguls and real estate operators were put in charge of rebuilding Lower Manhattan with virtually no labor input. The Great Depression and World War II were exceptions because workers built institutional power. in big new unions like the auto workers and the steel workers, and within the Democratic Party. An important lesson for us today. Like previous crises, the COVID pandemic has unmasked the failures of the old order. Washington and many state and local governments have failed spectacularly at their most basic responsibility to protect the health and safety of the people. Many businesses have displayed a shocking indifference to the well-being of their employees, even to their very lives. The cults of privatization, government downsizing, and lean production and distribution have proved disastrous. If this is the best society can do, the time has come to try something different. Now's the time for working people to step forward. Thank you.